So let's get started this afternoon. Just a couple of reminders before we plunge into the Roman Republic. Okay, we are on chapter 5. Remember, we have our first unit test due this week by Sunday night at midnight. So you've taken quizzes now, hopefully, so you kind of know how that system works. This will be same kind of thing, except more questions, multiple choice, over the 5 chapters, the lectures, and the text. So you'll see that down below here, where exam 1 is there. You can take it at any time. You can take it today if you want. You can take it tomorrow. Remember that for Tuesday, even though their class was canceled, I recorded a lecture, and it's posted right here, Roman Republic 1, and so be sure to watch that. That is the prequel to today. All right? So that being said, then let's go ahead and get started. I'll make an adjustment here on the fly. We're going to be talking about the Roman Republic, and today especially. All right, so today we're going to take a look at the Roman Republic, and in the previous lecture I talked about the beginnings of Rome, the geography of Rome, the first, second, and third Punic Wars. But I want to take a look now at the Roman Republic and take a look at some of the cultural influences that take place. After the Third Punic War, actually sort of in between the Second and the Third Punic War, but at about that same time, the Romans are also conquering Greece. They go to Macedonia, they go to mainland Greece that we've already talked about. They conquer that territory. So you might say that the Romans conquered the Greeks militarily, but the Greeks conquer the Romans intellectually, because much of what we study about the culture, the mythology, the architecture, the philosophy of ancient Rome is really being copied and imitated from ancient Greece. So after the war with the Macedonians then, as is the custom, and this is the way slavery worked in the ancient world, different than the more modern world. More modern world, slavery is mostly agricultural workers, right? For example, in America, in the South, slaves worked in cotton fields, they worked in plantations, that sort of thing. That's not the kind, you shouldn't picture that same kind of slavery with the Romans as far as what slaves were doing. Mostly what slaves were doing were household duties, cooking, taking care of children, cleaning, that sort of thing. But in this case, with the Greeks, they took several of them were highly educated, so they actually took them as slaves, but they worked as tutors, tutoring the children of the Romans. Okay? They tutored the children of the Romans. So here you see, a picture of a tutor. In fact, in the New Testament, it talks about the tutor, the one who goes alongside. In fact, the Holy Spirit is described in that way, a paraclete, the one who goes alongside. Okay, and that's really what these were. These tutors went with the children. They would train the children. They would give them their lessons, that sort of thing. But along the way, then, now all that Greek culture. Well, the Romans wanted it. They wanted their children to learn Homer. They wanted them to learn the Greek mythology. And so the Roman culture and the Greek culture are so intertwined that many people just call them Greco-Roman. They call it Greco-Roman culture. Okay? All right. So if we take a look at some of this, for example, in religion, the Romans had some of their own deities, and certainly their deities had their own names. But what happens is a kind of a merger or a blending of the Greek gods with the Roman gods, so that really they're virtually identical. They have different names, but a lot of their attributes are the same. And even their sort of stories, mythological stories of how they came to be and all that sort of thing, all that is copied from the Greeks. So it's a wholesale borrowing of Greek gods. We might say plagiarism, right? They just went on to Google and they typed in Zeus, they cut and pasted it over to Jupiter. Does that make sense? That's the kind of stuff they're doing. All right, so there we go. The main deity of the Romans is Jupiter. As you see pictured here, Jupiter is the god of thunder. He's the main god of the Romans. The main god of the Greeks is Zeus, as you might know. And so basically what they do is they just copy many of the attributes of Jupiter come from Zeus. What about Juno? Juno was the main female goddess of the Romans, and the you might, if you wanted to say wife of Jupiter, I guess you could put that. It would probably call him a consort, right? His main woman, his main deity, his main goddess. And same for Zeus, Hera. So many of the things of Hera then get copied over to Juno. Mars and Ares. Ares, the Greek. So the Greek names are on the right, the Roman or Latin names on the left. Mars and Ares. Perhaps you have heard of the book of Acts. If not, it's in the Bible, right? New Testament. In the book of Acts, Paul goes to speak, depending on what translation you look at, on Mars Hill, it's sometimes called, or the Areopagus. The Ares and Mars are the same. Okay, so a lot more we can say about Mars Hill, but let me just say that those names, sometimes you'll see it in, like the King James, it'll say Mars Hill. You see someone else, it'll call it the Areopagus, which means the hill of Ares. So, same kind of thing. Venus as Aphrodite. Now, a lot more we could say about these deities, but Venus, of course, is the goddess of love. Mars is the goddess of war. Juno is the special, I said Mars was a goddess. Mars is a god of war, sorry. And Juno is the goddess that is associated with women, with fertility, with childbearing, problems that, or things, issues would be connected with women especially, okay? Whereas Jupiter is sort of the god of thunder and, a powerful god like that. He's the chief god. Okay, let's move on. What about any area of philosophy? Well, we talked about last week the philosophy of the Hellenistic period. If you remember, we talked about the Stoics and the Epicureans and so forth. The Romans really latch on to that Hellenistic philosophy. That becomes the favorite kind of philosophy for the Romans. So Epicureanism with the Roman, so then the Romans will have their own, there'll be Greek authors of it, but the Roman author, like Lucretius, will advocate Epicureanism. If you remember, Epicureanism is the idea of hedone, or seeking happiness, which of course sometimes gets distorted into seeking pleasure. So the Epicureans then would want to remove things that they find unpleasant and add things that they like that are pleasant. Okay, so this is very popular with the Romans. Stoics or Stoicism, very popular as well. The guy pictured here, the statue here, or the bust on the left side of the screen, is Seneca. Seneca was a Stoic philosopher, a Roman Stoic philosopher. If you remember, the Stoics tried to avoid emotion, right? They said the things that happen to you are going to happen to you, kind of like fate. And since things are going to happen to you and they're beyond your control, you might as well just accept them. And there's no reason getting too emotional about it. In fact, avoid emotions. So if you hear bad news, well, don't boo-hoo a lot. If you hear great news, don't jump up and down cheering. Why? Because you had no control over those things. They're going to happen anyway. So the best thing for you is to live a very even life. I said it was kind of like Spock on Star Trek, but I got a lot of blank looks when I said that. So that's your homework. Go watch some Star Trek. Then you'll know what I'm talking about. Well, anyway, he was also the tutor of Nero. We'll talk about Nero next week. Not today, because that's in the next chapter, really. But Seneca becomes one of the most prominent Roman philosophers of Stoicism. Okay, so we've talked just to briefly mention religion, briefly mention philosophy. How about art? Yes, the Romans copied Greek art in many forms. Statues and paintings. For example, many times we no longer have the Greek original, but we have the Roman copy. Right? The Greek original is gone, but we have the Roman copy of the Greek original in statues, also in paintings. Almost no painting survives from the Greek period, but we do have paintings, several paintings, especially frescoes, that survive from the Roman period, especially a place like Pompeii, where it's been buried. So there is great copying of the artwork. Literature. There is great copying of Greek literature. Right? Especially the plays, the comedies, that sort of thing, other works. If they're not a direct copying, there's an imitation of them. So, for example, the Greek slaves that I just told you that were captured during the Macedonian Wars, they are not only tutoring students, but they're translating. They're taking those Greek classics, like Homer and other plays and poetry and stuff like that. They're translating it into Latin to make it more accessible to the Romans. So as we say, Homer's works and plays and so forth. And Plautus Plautus's comedies will be adapted by a playwright by the name of Terence. Terence is the Roman playwright who will freely adapt the Greek playwright. All right. In other words, the storyline is the same. He'll change the name of the characters, to make them into Latin names. He'll change the name of the places. So instead of talking about Athens, maybe it'll be Rome or some other place like that. It might change the setting, it might change the names, but basically, the dialogue's pretty much lifted. Pretty close. So it's just a wholesale copying of it with very little alterations. Okay? This is how much it gets embedded into Roman culture, Roman thinking. Okay? So there is some ways in which the Greeks influenced the Romans. Now, we want to shift gears and go to political developments. If you have listened to the lecture from Tuesday, when you say, wait a minute, classes were canceled on Tuesday. Yes, but not for us. That's one of the benefits. You can say it's a benefit. You get more for your money. Because even when there's a conference and they cancel class, I still sit in my office and record it for you. I talk to no one so that I can talk to all of you. Anyway, it's up on the MyFire thing. You click on it. It's about an hour, 55 minutes, something like that. It's Roman Republic 1. This will be labeled, I guess, Roman Republic 2. Well, anyway, in that last look, I talked about different political groups, and I talked about Roman family a little bit. There are two main groups that are going to form politically. These are known as the Populare Party and the Optimates Party. These are political parties. Okay? Now, the Populare is the same root for the word we get for popular or populace, right? So this would be a political group that is, well, I suppose, more popular with the populace that is poor. How's that? the peasants. We want to use a lot of P's. It's popular with the poor peasants is the Populare Party. Yeah? All right. And the Optimates is more popular with the those who are wealthier and the senatorial class of people. Now, we could also enter into this to a discussion which I don't really want to get too in-depth in, which would be sort of conservative and liberal, right? Conservative and liberal can mean a lot of different things, depending on the context, and really depending on who you're talking to. Anybody that's to the right of you is conservative, and anybody who's to the left of you is liberal. So it's kind of a individual thing sometimes. But in general terms, those who are conservative want to have change, but they want to have change come slowly, in a measured way. Those who are liberal want to have change that comes quickly. Okay? So it's not that, conservatives don't want any change. They do want change. They want it to be a slow and measured change. Whereas the others want a very quick and, I suppose the conservatives say, sometimes reckless change. Right? So you might think of it in that way if you want. If you want to think of the Populares as the liberals and the Optimates as the conservatives, I don't know. Maybe that's not helpful at all. But basically, the Populares Party wants a lot of changes, and they want them quickly. The Optimates want change. I don't think they don't want change, but any change that comes, they want it to be much slower. Now, two heroes of the Populares Party, they get mentioned in your text and that we should mention here. They are the Gracchi brothers. Now, if I was opening, we're going to have a pizza place just right outside our door here soon. I know you're excited about that because you'll want to bring your pizza in here. The only rule is, if you bring the pizza in, you just got to bring enough for all of us. I think that's fair. We should all get an equal and fair amount of pizza. But anyway, I would not call it, what are they going to call it? Papa John's. Oh, I just said a corporate name. Sorry. Whatever they're going to call it, Fred's Pizza. I would call it Gracchi Brothers Pizza. Huh? Gracchi Brothers. I thought that would be the name of the pizzeria I'll never have one, but if I did. I make pizzas at my house. Make my own dough, make my own sauce. When I had my party that I invited all of you to back in January, which I don't think any of you came, I made homemade pizzas for everybody. I have the toppings there, whatever you want, put on it. Bake it. I've got stones in my oven. Got a little paddle. I bring it in and out. Yeah, well, they go fast. When they come out, they don't last long. So maybe I could open my own pizzeria. I would probably call it Gracchi Brothers Pizza. Well, there's two brothers then. That's why it's Gracchi. They're Gracchus, plural, Gracchi. Tiberius and Gaius. Okay, Tiberius is the older one. Let's talk about him first. He becomes tribune in 133 BC. Tribune is an office that's only for those of the plebeian class. So remember, Romans were born into a class, either patrician or plebeian. Go watch that last video. I'll talk a lot more about it. But basically, you're born to that. You can't change it. You're born in a certain class, you'll die in that same class. Okay? So, basically, as reforms come to try to give the plebeians more say, there is an office that is created of tribune. Tribune, then, is only for someone from the plebeian class. So now the Populares Party is pretty much made up of mostly plebeians and then, I suppose, patricians who are sympathetic to the plebeian situation. Right? Now, one of the main issues here was land, as it often is, land. And what Tiberius Gracchus wanted to do was to give land to the landless. Many people in Rome did not have land. In fact, after the Punic Wars, we're going to see that many people flee the countryside because of the war, and they'll come to Rome. They'll leave the farms and they'll come to Rome, looking for job, looking for food. So many of them didn't have any land. He wanted to give land to the landless. Now, he wanted to give the public fields. What are the public fields? We might think of the public fields as those things that are parks today, right? By the way, I noticed several people using their phones extensively. Please, I've asked at the beginning of the semester, don't be texting and driving, texting and sitting in class. It's very dangerous for your grade. All right? I always tell people, if that special someone cannot wait 50 minutes to hear from you, here's my advice. I'm not a relationship advisor, but here's my advice. If someone cannot be out of contact with you for 50 minutes, then get away from them right now. That's my advice. Okay? It's not going to get better. Okay. That's just a sideline. That won't be on the test. Okay. Now, what he tried to do was run for tribune again. This was against the law, really, because the office of tribune was you only ran for it once, and you had it for 1 year. Some people might want to implement this in the United States politics, where you could be president, and you're only president once, and maybe only for 1 year. See? Then you come in, you want to make change, you make your change, and then the next person comes in. Well, that's the way the Romans did it with tribune. That's the way they did it with their consuls as well. The people at the top only were in office for 1 hour, for 1 day. No, for 1 year. So you didn't notice anyway. Okay. Now, when he tries to run for tribune again, of course, he was very unpopular with certain people because he kept pushing this idea of taking the public lands and giving them to the landless. These were lands that were set aside. We might think of them like, a national forest, a national park. Up where I used to live in Kentucky, we had a huge part of Kentucky that was the Daniel Boone National Forest. Nobody used it. It was just there. There were no facilities. It was not a park. I guess maybe if you were very adventurous, you might try to go there and hike some or something. But, there were no facilities. I can tell you what it was used for if you want to know. It was mostly used by people growing marijuana. Because the laws are, if you're growing marijuana and you're growing it on your own property, the government will seize your property. Right? I still think that law is imposed. Who knows anymore? But that's the way the law was. And so people did not want to grow this on their own, like in their backyard or out in the field somewhere, because they'd lose their land. They went to the Daniel Boone National Forest. They cleared out a section of trees, and they planted it up on a hilltop somewhere where you get a lot of good sunshine. Okay? Hard to detect. They'd get up there with ATVs, those little four-wheel things. They'd go up there, harvest it, bring it down, sell it. They were in or out. If anybody showed up, they could hear them. They'd take off different directions down the hill. They knew the way out. Okay? So that's what happened. By the way, they began to use helicopters and thermal imaging. They would find out where this was, and then they were sending in special units of the police in black helicopters that would repel out of the helicopters to try to catch these guys. And they did. I knew that because the helicopters used to land on the campus where I taught to get lunch at the McDonald's, So anyway, one of the professor's sons was a state trooper, and he was involved doing that. So that's how I learned about it. But anyway, those are public lands. Nobody's really using them. And so what happens is other people start to use it. In this case, rich people started to use the lands that were public to, say, graze their sheep, things like that. Began to use them for different purposes, maybe even cultivate them. And what he wants to do is now take those lands that are public away and divide them up and give it to people who don't have land. That was not popular. And when he tried to run for office again, he was assassinated really by senators. Senators who said, this guy is breaking all the laws. That basically kind of turned Tiberius Gracchus into a martyr, a hero to many who said he gave up his life trying to help the people. His brother, about 10 years later, his brother is going to run for the same office, and he was elected in 123, pretty much on the same kind of stuff his older brother had been talking about. And then he was actually reelected in 122 BC, he was killed by a mob. Now, some people wonder if it was really a mob or if it was orchestrated. But at any rate, we see these two brothers trying to push for rights of the Populares party. Both of them end up dying by being killed by senators or mobs of people, So, quite famous. It just shows you some of the political struggle that's going on between these political parties and between these classes of people. All right, let's move on. What we're going to enter then, as we enter from, let's say, the late 2nd century, so let's say around 130, 120 BC down to about 30 BC, is a period of a lot of conflict for Rome. And this is the last part of the Roman Republic. We have a century of civil wars, people rebelling, and powerful generals are sent to put down these rebellions. An interesting one, and I'll highlight a few of these, is a guy by the name of Jugurtha. Now, you're looking for a good name for your baby boy? Jugurtha, I think, is a great name. You could call him Jug for short. I don't know, something like that. Juggy. Jughead? No, you don't want to do that. Well, Jugurtha is in fact from North Africa, and he is a Numidian. The Numidians lived in the mountains of North Africa. Okay? Just to the south of North Africa is a huge desert, the Sahara. But along the coast of what today this would be Tunisia, those areas, like Morocco, Tunisia, but he was mostly in the area of Tunisia. There are mountains there called the Atlas Mountains. Atlas Mountains, A-T-L-A-S. Those people who lived there were called Numidians. The Numidians had teamed up with the Romans to fight against the Carthaginians in the Punic Wars, especially in the famous Battle of Zama in 202 BC, which, when you listen to the other video, you'll hear about, at least be mentioned. Now, what happens then over the next, say, 80 years, it becomes clear that the Numidians had hoped that they would actually be liberated from the Carthaginians and then sort of be on their own. But what they really did was replace the Carthaginians with the Romans. Now the Romans were controlling them, and some of them didn't like it. The Romans actually set up client kings in different parts of the Mediterranean world. Kings, they still had kingdoms, but they were subjugated by the Romans. You know of one of these client kings. I'm pretty confident you know of one. His name is Herod. Right? Herod in Palestine is a client king of the Romans. And there are many others, but here's one, Jugurtha. Now, what he does is he rebels against the Romans in 116. And at first, he has some easy victories early victories, because the Romans aren't yet really mobilized for this, sort of takes them off guard. But then once they get down there with their military might, they capture the guy, they stop the rebellion, they bring him back to Rome, they will march him through the streets of Rome to humiliate him. The general who had defeated him will be in a chariot, and in chains behind him will be Jugurtha, and the people will sneer, throw stuff at him, right? I would say rotten tomatoes, but they didn't have any tomatoes in Italy until after 1500 AD, so that's not going to happen. But they will also then take any goods that they took. This was a common thing. This is what the Romans did. Roman generals, when they were victorious, would get what we might call a parade, a triumphal procession, triumphal march. In fact, by the way, in the book of Colossians, it is mentioned that Jesus has a triumph, triumphing over the enemy like Satan. The Roman citizens would have really understood what that meant. That's a humiliation. That's a public display. That's what happens to Jugurtha. And then he is executed in Rome after his public display. Well, the person who leads this is General Marius. We need to remember him because he becomes quite powerful. And also his assistant, sort of the guy that helps him militarily, is named Sulla. They don't agree on politics, but they do agree about military. So Marius and Sulla are going to be two of the early generals that are quite popular and quite powerful in this century of civil wars, I'm calling it. All right, let's move on. Oh, by the way, just showing you where Numidia is. Do you see it there in the sort of left center? Numidia. This is what the Romans called Africa, North Africa. It's really a Latin word that describes this area across the Mediterranean. You might also see just above Numidia a thing called Hippo Regulus. You see that? It's right there. You might have heard of a guy by the name of Augustine. If not, you will be hearing about him a little later. His name is Augustine of Hippo. He's the bishop. Later on, he's a Christian bishop here. Very famous Christian author. Augustine writes his Confessions, and he writes the City of God, and so forth. If these are things you're not familiar with, I hope for the end of the semester you'll be a little more familiar with it. But that's where he's from, while the map's up there. Now, let's talk about other rebellions that are going to need generals to put it down. There are Germanic peoples to the north. You see on the map here where Italy is. You see Cisalpine Gaul, and you see then Gaul. Right? Cisalpine Gaul means on this side of the Alps, Gaul. That's way up in the northern part of Italy, the Italian peninsula. Then there's the Alps, and then on the other side is Gaul, here in green, and then especially the stuff that's in red or pink. Marius is sent to subdue the rebellion in Gaul. There are two main Germanic tribes up there, the Cimbri and the Teutones. That's where we get later the word Teutonic from. He puts down this rebellion. You see, when a general does this, he gets the power to command an army, and then he goes off and does this, and he comes back. The soldiers are loyal to him because they have won, and they have received gifts from their victory. So he has a lot of support. When he gets back to Rome, he's kind of a hero because he stopped the rebellion. Marius then is elected consul 5 times. Now remember, consul, you're only supposed to serve 1 year. However, they began to sort of ignore the idea that you would only do it once. And he began to do it repeatedly for 1 year each. So he did it 5 years out of 7. He was the consul. He was a consul. Remember, there are 2 consuls at a time. But this means he is extremely powerful, and his power in the military field is going to be translated over into the political field. All right? And increasingly, we're going to see Rome is governed by generals as we approach the end of the Republic. Later on, by the way, on the map here, all that sort of pinkish, reddish stuff up there, that part of Gaul is conquered by Julius Caesar. But that's going to come in the 50s, and we're, 54, 55, and we're talking about in the 100s, right? This rebellion, 102, 101. So about 50 years later. All right, let's move on. Now there's other turmoil, trouble within. Remember that Rome started off not controlling all of the Italian peninsula, only had a very small part. And they had to conquer the Italian peninsula and bring it under Rome's control. That's covered in the last talk that's on the video, right? I keep referring to it. But it's on there. And anyway, Rome had to fight a whole series of battles with a whole series of people to come into power. They had solidified their control over the Italian peninsula. But what happens is those people that the Romans conquered on the Italian peninsula are not considered Roman citizens. Roman citizenship were only for Romans. The problem is that these people are now increasingly incorporated into the Roman army, into a lot of things that Rome is doing. in essence, you might think of them as being half citizens. They get some benefit, but they're not full citizens. What these people want then is they want full citizenship. Full citizenship. So they will revolt. These are sometimes called the social wars or the Soki wars. These are the wars of society, if you will, of these people who are within the Italian peninsula, but they're not Roman citizens. And finally, the concession is made that if they will pledge their allegiance to Rome, they will be granted full citizenship as a Roman citizen. And they did that. And now I think we can say by 88 BC that the Italian peninsula is finally united. They're all Roman citizens. And this was part of the problem when Hannibal showed up with his armies that we talked about last time. Is that, he kept marching around Italy fighting, and he didn't get a lot of resistance from people because they said, you know what, we're not fully Roman citizens. You want to beat up on the Roman citizens? Well, we got other things to do, right? So now the Italian peninsula is more fully unified. Let's take a look then at a map of Roman territory. You see there in the center it says Italy. It's kind of purple color with Rome in the center. The Italian peninsula has been unified up to the First Punic War. Then you see that sort of salmon color. It's Sicily and across the North Africa and Spain. Those are territories added by the end of the Punic Wars. And then you see Numidia and Gaul. And you see Macedonia over here in Greece. This was added to Roman territory. And finally, by the time you get to Julius Caesar, all of this sort of yellow color is added as well. Gaul, Egypt, Syria, all that stuff is added towards the end of the Republic period. Well, let's talk about some of these areas that are added, like Asia Minor. Asia Minor, by the way, is over here in what we would call Turkey. You see Bithynia up there. And then you see Asia. Sometimes they just call this Asia, or sometimes it's called Asia Minor. Today we call it Turkey. If you read in the New Testament Peter's letters, they are addressed to people from Bithynia. That's where Bithynia is. And when you read, for example, the book of Galatians, the letter to Galatians is written to people from right about in the same area too. All right? And Cilicia down here, that's actually the area where Paul is born. He's from Tarsus. So that's in Cilicia. That's the region of Cilicia. Anyway, a lot of stuff overlaps with New Testament geography. Well, in Asia Minor, there is one of these sort of client kings, if we want to call that, rulers. His name is Mithridates. Mithridates. Mithridates, his name comes from the god Mithras. And we don't have time to talk about the god Mithras today, other than to say it was a god from the east who became hugely popular in the Roman Empire, and it was for men only. There were some religions that were only for women. This one was only for men. So it was very popular with Roman soldiers. And it involved, well, again, we don't have enough time, but it involved, one of the things that involved being initiated by going into a pit. And over the pit would be a sort of a grate that was placed. They would bring a bull over the pit, and they would kill the bull, and they would cut its throat, and the blood would come down through the grate and down into the pit, and it would coat the initiates who were en natural in their birthday suit, and this tarabolium, as it was called, was the way they were initiated. A sprinkling of the blood of the bull on the initiates. Well, a lot more to it, but he takes his name from Mithridates. He's in Pontus, and Pontus is way up there by the Black Sea, pretty close to where I showed you Bithynia was, the south coast of the Black Sea. What he does is he decides that he can rebel against the Romans, and he declares war on the Romans. He wants to take over not only his territory, but all of Asia Minor. Part of the way he stirred people up to rebel against the Romans were the way the Romans collected their taxes. You might think the only way to collect the taxes is the way we do it here in the United States. Not true. Many other ways. Here in the United States, we have the IRS, right? You get a job, presumably. You get a job, hopefully. You get a job. Then your employer, if you're employed, they will take out money every week, every 2 weeks, every month, whenever you get paid. They take out a percentage of it, and they send it to good old Uncle Sam. So he can do whatever he wants to with it, right? Now, then at the end of the year, since you've been sending your money to the government all year, then you've got to file a form to try to get some of your money that you already sent them back. And that's not easy. They don't want to give it to you. All right? So, you got to do all this paperwork. There's all these forms and schedules and deductions or whatever. It's very complicated. Then you may or may not get any money back. All right? And if you don't go through that process, then some agents from the IRS will probably come and visit you, and lots of bad things are going to happen to you. All right, so we'll just leave it at that. That's sort of the way our system works. Now, the Romans didn't do it that way. They kept the government out of the tax business. How can that be? They basically took private companies, and we might think of it that way, like a corporation or private company, to collect the taxes and then forward them to the government. It'd be as if they said, for the state of Florida, the United States government wants so many millions or billions of dollars in taxes. Corporations would bid on it and say, okay, we will collect this much tax for the government. Then they go out and collect the taxes. They send it to the government. They keep, obviously, a percentage for themselves as profit and cover costs. And you don't have any IRS department. You save all that money, and the money just rolls into the U.S. Treasury. And again, they, of course, spend it very carefully and frugally for all of our best interests. Because I know this is being recorded, and there are microphones everywhere. Okay, so it'll all be wonderful. But now the Romans did it that way, and what happened was they would have, this is why, for example, there was a tax collector in the New Testament. You remember? Remember who that was? Matthew. Matthew was the tax collector. And tax collectors were hated. They hated the tax collectors. Why? Because people don't like to pay taxes anyway. I'll just give you, if you don't know that, most people don't like to pay taxes. If you love to pay taxes, then your life will be much easier as the future rolls around for you, because you're going to be more and more taxes for you to pay. At any rate, most people don't like to pay taxes. They say, you know what, I went out and worked very hard to get this money. Now you want me to give you 10, 15, 20, 30% of what I have earned? You want me to hand it over to an entity that's going to do stuff with it that I don't know what they're doing, I have no control over? A lot of people don't like that. Now imagine if you knew you were handing over your money to somebody, say in this room, like we got a tax collector over here, all of us after class got to go over and give them a percentage of whatever we made last week. We know that that percentage is going to be overcharged because he's going to pocket some himself before he gives it to his employer. Then his employer is going to pocket some of it before they give it to the government. All right, that's called profit, I guess, or whatever. What do we call it now? We call it a service and handling fee. Okay. Well, anyway, people didn't like that. They joined into the rebellion. Bottom line was Mithridates was defeated. So if you're a Mithridates fan, sorry. Spoiler alert, he loses. Sulla is the consul at the time. The Senate orders him to put down this rebellion. Now, Sulla and Marius they had worked together, they were rivals. And Marius had been kind of kicked out of Rome, and when Sulla leaves town to go to Asia Minor, Turkey, to put down this rebellion, we're going to see that Marius' supporter wanted to take back power. Sulla is already marching off to do this when he gets word of what's going on. And in fact, he turns around and he marches back to Rome. He will use force then to keep himself in power. Now, this was illegal, really, but there wasn't anyone really going to challenge it at this point. Eventually, he will make a tense peace with Mithridates, and eventually Mithridates will be defeated. But this now has set a precedent that these powerful generals don't like to give up the power, and then they begin to fight with one another. And this is going to lead to civil war, general versus general. Powerful leader versus powerful leader in actual physical conflict, armed conflict. So let's take a look at that. Marius and Sulla. Marius makes problems in Rome while Sulla's away. And now we see a civil war ensues. Again, spoiler alert, Sulla wins. We jump right to it in 82 BC. And then Sulla is able to take the title, or obtains the title, dictator for life. That's not a bad job if you can get it, right? Remember, the Romans had the title of dictator for emergencies. It was supposed to be for emergencies only, because, Rome had a republic, and if you have a committee of people or a large group of people trying to make decisions, it often leads to trouble, stalemate, and takes a long time. Exhibit A, the American Congress, right? There's a lot of debate. And some people argue, well, they should just all agree and everybody get along. That's not the way it was designed. They're supposed to argue. You see? Democracy, really a republic, is messy business. It was designed that way to avoid having a king. The president's not supposed to be a king or a dictator. Congress is supposed to impede what the president wants, I would say. Not just for everything, for no reason, but for real reasons to counter and balance. It's called checks and balances. Well, anyway, the problem is, though, when you've got a big committee, like say all of us in here decide we're all going to decide everything together. We couldn't even agree what time to have class if we all decide. We'd have a hard time. Well, Thursdays aren't really good for me. I don't like to get up early, and that's lunchtime is at 12, and somebody else say, well, I got something I got to do at 2, and I can't do that. And the next thing you know, we wouldn't have any time we could meet. It's very hard. You get this many people, 20 people, 30 people, you try to get them together, very hard to make a decision. Okay, so that's why we have some people in charge, and sometimes they just make decisions, and you got to live with it, like the registrar or somebody does who assigned us this room in this class time. We just got to live with it. Okay, but here's the problem. Let's say, for example, we are under attack. Let's say we know somebody is coming from the parking lot over there, and they're headed this way. And so I say, you know what? We've always decided everything together. What do you guys think we ought to do? And everybody goes, well, I think we ought to go out this door over here. And somebody says, we ought to go out that door. Somebody says, we ought to barricade that door and just stay here. Maybe they won't even see us. Or whatever. We would have 20 different ideas, probably, or at least 5 or 6. And by the time we maybe made a decision, they'd probably be here, right? Or if there's a fire or something, what are we going to do? How are we going to get out of here? Who's in charge? So in times of emergency, it is good to have somebody in charge. Somebody to make a decision and say, this is what we're doing. We're going out that door, and we're going now. Let's go. See? Now, was that the right decision? Well, I guess we'll find out. But if we have no decision becomes a decision. Remember that in life. Many decisions are made because you will not make a decision. This is why almost everything you do has a deadline. Almost everything you do has a deadline. Why? Because people refuse to make decisions until the deadline. Most people. For example, you got a test that's due by midnight Sunday night. Most people won't even start thinking about that till about 11 p.m. Okay? And by the way, there's 50 questions on that test. So if you wait till 11 o'clock, I hope everything goes very smoothly, because I think at 11:59 it will shut you off. So you don't want to wait till 11 o'clock. But that's what people do. When's the deadline? I got plenty of time. Okay? All right. Well, I don't know how you got me onto that. Sulla will become a dictator, but then you know what he does? Surprisingly, a couple years later, 79 BC, he retires. And he goes off, and according to the records, he lives in a nice little house, and he goes out and has flowers, and he does gardening, and he just kind of relaxes and says, look, I'm done. So he got all the power. He had it for a few years, and he said, I've had enough. Now, it doesn't always work that way. He dies just a year later. Maybe he knew it was time to retire because he knew, he wasn't feeling well. I don't know. He died about a year later. I'll probably die in the middle of a lecture. So don't be surprised. I knew a guy who passed out lecturing. He fell right on the floor. It was a history class. So the students are very concerned. They called the ambulance and everything. And then, a week or two later, he was back lecturing again. And when he walked for the first time, he walked in and he brought a pillow and he put it down on the spot where he fell. He said, just in case it happens again, I'll have a softer landing. And he told the class, I always wanted to go down in history. So there you go. He did. Well, he was kind of a funny guy. He had a lot of interesting things that he said. We won't repeat all of them. Final stage then of the Republic, 78 to 27 BC. Generals are dominating, as you can already tell, Rome. We see the rise of this guy, Pompey, who kept pushing to be called Pompey the Great. He was a former associate of Sulla. I call him a henchman. I think we could say he's arrogant. No, most people would not argue with you about that. He persuaded Sulla to give him the title the Great. So his title is Pompey the Great. He was sent to put down a rebellion in Spain, which will take 5 years. So these rebellions don't stop. See, the Romans have conquered a lot of territory all over, from Turkey to Spain, from North Africa all the way up to Germany and France. They're having troubles in these areas. They have to go and assert their authority. Of course, that'll really make a name for Pompey and make a lot of connections for him in Spain. Now, the next general I want to mention is a guy by the name of Crassus. What's going to happen here, again, spoiler alert, there's going to be 3 generals who are going to rise up. They're going to become very powerful, and then they're going to say, you know what? Instead of fighting with one another, why don't we team up? This Roman territory is big enough for 3 of us. It's kind of divided up. Well, that's what they do. Crassus is the next guy. Again, another buddy of Sulla. But he had been able to amass a great amount of wealth. He's always described as extremely wealthy. One of the things that he did was put down the slave rebellion led by Spartacus in 73 BC. Every Roman would have known about this, because this happens right in Italy. Spartacus. If you've never heard of Spartacus, I know they had some kind of TV show about it. I would recommend the movie. There was a movie from back in the 60s with Kirk Douglas. That's what I would recommend. Watch that movie, Spartacus. Well, anyway, Spartacus was a soldier who was captured and enslaved. He was trained near Mount Vesuvius, and then he leads a rebellion that grows into a massive rebellion, and he's finally put down. The rebellion's put down. He's crucified along with lots of these other guys along the Appian Way. That's the way again, spoiler alert. Sorry. Spartacus lost. If you're going to watch the movie, I guess you'll know. Well, I mean, people watch movies, they know. If you ever saw the movie Titanic, I think you knew what was going to happen, right? The ship's going to sink. Why watch the movie? You already know how it's going to end. Anyway, he was a captured Thracian soldier sent to gladiatorial school. Now you're going to get to see a picture of Kirk Douglas. He's still alive, by the way. He's like almost 100 years old, man, like 98 years old. His son is Michael Douglas. You may have heard of him, but he's pretty old too. Anyway, he went to gladiator training school. They were all enslaved, where they would teach them how to fight. And a lot of these guys broke out of that school and started this rebellion. Crassus came to put it down. Eventually he will. So here is the movie I'm talking about, Spartacus. That's Kirk right there, Kirk Douglas. They overpower their guards. They escape to Mount Vesuvius nearby. And then people start joining them, slaves and criminals and all kinds of... In all, they had 70,000 people that joined this rebellion, which started with just, a handful, maybe 20 people or 30 people. Grows to thousands and thousands of them. And, they weren't trained as soldiers. Spartacus was trained as a soldier. Some of these other guys had been. But a lot of these are just slaves. And they brought whatever they had. They brought like a pick or a sickle or whatever farm tools maybe they had, or household knives or something. And okay, we're going to rebel. And so the Romans tried to put this down, but they roamed around the Italian peninsula fighting and winning for a couple of years. Finally, Crassus will defeat them, and he will kill Spartacus. Spartacus is ordered to be crucified along the Appian Way, along with hundreds and hundreds of others, so that like every quarter mile there was a crucifixion along the road. Yeah? That must be the TV show. Is that a TV show?
No, because I saw it in...
Yeah. I think, well, it may be in the movie. Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. I think the ladies would like Spartacus. I know the ladies like it Kirk Douglas. They used to. He had that dimple in his chin. That was the thing. It was his trademark. Had a little dimple right there. Well, anyway, you can kind of see it on that picture. All right. 6,000 rebels are crucified along the Appian Way, just to make the point that slavery and slave rebellion would not be tolerated. Well, think about this. Many, many Romans had slaves in their homes taking care of their children, cooking their food, sleeping in their houses. You got these people that want to kill you and you're sleeping in the same house and they're taking care of your children. You don't want to think that they're wanting to kill you or they're really that mad at you. And so you want to make sure they stay, reasonably in control, right? Well, anyway, that was the case. Let's move on. Now, Pompey and Crassus emerge as two of the most powerful generals during this period. Pompey comes back from Spain. He joins in the final victory over Spartacus. And we'll see that Pompey and Crassus then are made consuls in 70 BC. Remember, at the top of the Roman government were consuls, and there were always two of them. And these two guys were both powerful generals, and they're both consuls at the same time. So they worked together to try to reduce some of the powers of the senatorial class and the Senate, so that basically they could have more power. So here is a carving of Pompey the Great, as he wants to be called. Now, there's going to be another incident that will bring Pompey to go and fight, and this is going to be against pirates. Johnny Depp and all those guys. Going to have to fight against the pirates. Piracy did not start with Johnny Depp in the Caribbean. Piracy's been around probably as long as there's been boats and things of steel. Okay? All right. So the Romans had a lot of problems with pirates around the Mediterranean. So you don't want to think of those Caribbean kind of pirates, but they're pirates nonetheless. They sailed, they had hideouts where they would go to different islands around the Mediterranean. And they would attack ships and take the cargo off of it, that kind of thing. Now, in one incident, they got so bold that the pirates came right up to the harbor of Rome and attacked it at Ostia. That's pretty bold. They're not out somewhere in a remote area of the Mediterranean attacking in some remote harbor. They're coming right to the main harbor of Rome. This would be like pirate ships coming into New York or someplace like that and saying, hey, we're just taking all the goods right out here in the bay. You can't stop us, right? Or somewhere else along the East Coast. We think of pirates like a long ways away, but they're right here. So this gets everybody up in arms. They have bases of operation in Cilicia, which is the southern part of Turkey where I tell you Paul was born, and also on the island of Crete. These are two big places. Part of the problem was every time they tried to stop the pirates would just pack up and move somewhere else. And what would happen is typically someone would only be given power in a certain area. They'd say, well, we got a lot of pirates over there in Greece, so go stop it. And they would go over and try to stop the piracy in Greece, and the pirates would just move somewhere else. They moved to Turkey. They move out to the islands. And then really you didn't have the authority. You have to go back to the Senate and say, hey, they moved here or they moved here. So what Pompey does is he goes to the Senate and he says, I want power of imperium to control an army and to take care of this all around the Mediterranean. And not only on the Mediterranean, but 50 miles inland from the Mediterranean. Now you take a look at a map of the Mediterranean, you start measuring in 50 miles from all the coastline. This is pretty wide sweeping power. Any island, he can go anywhere on the island. 50 miles inland is all the major cities. So that's what he does. Now, he's successful. Within 3 months, there is no threat from pirates. Pompey will also then, he's over in the east fighting them. He will go down the coastline and conquer some territory over there that had been a problem. This, by the way, is where he conquers Syria. What today would be Syria and Lebanon. And will take also the Decapolis in 63 BC. The Decapolis mentioned in the Gospels. 10 cities, actually more than 10 cities, located in Palestine, Syria, and what today would be Jordan and Israel and Syria. So he adds a lot of territory, but he puts the problem down. So here is a coin that shows Pompey with a ship. Now here's a map that shows you where he went. He went from up here at Seleucia, up here in the southern part of Turkey. He comes down along the coastline of what today would be Syria and Lebanon. He comes all the way down to Palestine, and he adds the territory of the Decapolis and so forth. Okay? Pompey the Great. And by the way, this just shows you where the Decapolis is. This is sort of Palestine in the New Testament period or Roman period. So this is going to transform things in Palestine, very important for your New Testament studies. But it's Pompey the Great, and then his conquering of that in 64, 63 BC sets the calendar over in this part of the world. Well, now we see the third of these generals to rise to power. His name, of course, this is the most famous one that I'm sure you've heard of. His name is Julius Caesar. You've heard of him, right? Julius Caesar. And he does have a pizza place, right? Little Caesars. Little Caesars Pizza. And they used to say pizza. They used to say pizza because when you bought one pizza, they gave you two pizzas. But they abandoned that a while back. They don't say that anymore. Now you just got to buy one pizza like everybody else. But that was sort of their gimmick at the beginning. I remember the commercials, the guy going to say, I want a pizza. And he said, well, you got to have two pizzas. No, I only want one pizza. You buy one pizza, you get two pizzas. Same price. Now you just pay for one. And you get one. Well, anyway, we're talking a lot about pizza today. I guess I'm hungry for pizza. Well, Pompey's over in the east. Meanwhile, Julius Caesar is gaining power. He's going up through the Cursus Honorum, through all of the different offices of the Roman government. As aedile in 65 BC, he borrowed a lot of money from Crassus to pay for the games, to make a name for himself. And then he becomes Pontifex Maximus, that is the great priest, high priest. Yes. The one in the Bible? Well, Caesar, you're talking about Augustus Caesar. Augustus Caesar he'll be mentioned shortly, but it's not this one. He would actually be just a little bit after this. Yes? No. Julius Caesar? No. Well, the Caesar, yeah, we'll get to that later. But yes, Jesus was executed during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Yeah. Who is the one after Augustus Caesar, and Augustus Caesar is the one after Julius Caesar. So we're getting a lot of spoiler alerts now. Okay, so he becomes Pontifex Maximus in 63 BC. So he's really moving up. Now, so what happens, we've got three powerful guys who are three powerful leaders, and they decide that they would form a partnership. This is going to be called the triumvirate. It comes from the Latin word tri, which means three, and the word virus, or vira, means man. So three men, okay, three people. This is a partnership. This is illegal, by the way, and it's secret. They don't announce it. So as you can see, I know I don't want you to be too overwhelmed by my PowerPoint skills in creating this elaborate graph for you on this screen. You know, I slave hours over the hot computer to bring you these kind of images that, you know, you just couldn't find anywhere else. Crassus, Caesar, and Pompey in a triumvirate. I know. Don't try to figure out how I did it. Just enjoy it, learn it, memorize it. Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. This is illegal arrangement to control Roman territory, and it's secret. They don't tell anybody because it's illegal. These three guys get together and say, you know what? We're three powerful guys. We can divide things up between us. There's plenty to go around, and so that's what they do, in fact. Now, that's all right, you know, as long as these three guys get along. Which, by the way, they don't, okay? Especially Caesar and Pompey do not get along at all. They're both very arrogant. But Crassus sort of balances them out. Says, hey, fellas, come on. We all are smart. There's plenty for all of us. There's no reason to fight. But what happens is, Crassus dies. In 53 BC, he went over to the east, to Parthia, that you see on the map here. He's fighting with the Parthians, and in 53 BC, he dies in battle, and the buffer between Pompey and Caesar is gone. Pompey is in Rome, and Caesar is up in Gaul, which today would be France. And so then, as Caesar marches his army back to Italy, Pompey, in a very threatening way, basically tells Caesar, you know, this deal is over. Disband your army. And Julius Caesar does not disband his army. So what we see happening then is another civil war. That is a war between two very powerful men, Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar, both of them generals, both of them powerful military leaders, are going to come and fight a battle for the control of Rome. Spoiler alert, Julius Caesar wins. I know, no reason to watch the movie now. And by the way, Julius Caesar was dead through the whole movie. No, he wasn't. That's another movie. That's another spoiler alert for a different movie. So there's a civil war. Julius Caesar is supposed to disband his army, as all generals were, before they approached Rome. When he got to the Rubicon River, which I show on a map, it's on some of the maps, it's a smaller river. It's mainly important because it is this boundary. Once you cross this, you're supposed to disband your army, and you're not supposed to march any further with them. Julius Caesar decides to march his army across the Rubicon. He crosses the Rubicon, and when he does, he will write and say, "The die is cast." What does he mean when he says the die is cast? Any guesses? Well, people will die. I don't think he means die in that way, but yes, die. What else is a die? A color? Well, that's usually with a Y. D-Y-E is die. Yeah, this is D-I-E. You can't go back. Yeah. You know, you might think of it as a die. There's also a die like you make a mold and it's a die and you put something in it. You can't change it. But it might also mean, you ever heard of dice? Dice is the plural of die. The die is cast. He put the die in his hand, and he's thrown it. What's going to happen? What number is it going to land on? Is he going to win? Is it going to work? Well, it doesn't matter. He's already tossed it. In other words, you can't go back. You're right. He can't go back. He's already, I think maybe that's what it means. But anyway, basically he's saying, yeah, he can't go back. And in fact, you know what he does to the bridge of the Rubicon? He burns it. Ever heard anybody say you shouldn't burn your bridges? He did burn his bridge because he didn't want anybody sneaking up behind him. Easily, anyway. So he burned his bridges. He cast the die. He took a gamble. He took a risk. And he marches on Rome. Spoiler alert, he gains control of Italy. He defeats Pompey. Pompey, by the way, when he sees he's going to lose, he takes off for Spain because he got a lot of power there. Remember, he put down a rebellion there. And so Julius Caesar chases him to Spain, defeats his forces in Spain. And what does Pompey do? Pompey flees to the east because Pompey had a lot of, remember, he was over in the east. He conquered Syria and down in that part of the world. So he flees to the east from one side of the Mediterranean to the other. Julius Caesar follows him there. He's not going to let him get away. When he chases him to the east, Pompey shows up finally in Egypt. And the leader of Egypt is a guy named Ptolemy. And he has a sister, half-sister, named Cleopatra. They are, by the way, supposedly married. They're married, but they're kind of estranged. They're fighting over who's in control. And when Caesar comes to chase Pompey to the east, we'll see that Pompey flees to Egypt, where he is assassinated by Ptolemy the 14th. And he's sort of presented to him as a, hey, look what I did to help you out. Julius Caesar is a little taken aback, but it did take care of the problem for him. However, while he is there in Egypt, he meets a young lady. Julius Caesar is about 52 years old. Cleopatra is about 20 years old. Cleopatra, according to the story, and that's what this illustration is here, she has to be snuck in to see him because technically her and her brother are fighting and she's exiled out of the city. She has herself rolled up in a rug, a big rug. And the rug is carried into Caesar's room. And when the guys are carrying this rug in with her inside, they take the rug down and they roll it out on the floor. There is Cleopatra. She starts to talk to Julius Caesar, and they quickly become friends. And she uses his influence, his power, for her to gain control back of Egypt and to depose her brother. And that begins a rather long relationship between the most famous of the Cleopatras, and Julius Caesar. They will, in fact, sail on the Nile, on her boat. Well, eventually, she will give birth to his son. So I guess they're a little more than friends. They will call him Caesarion. We're about out of time here, so what I'm going to do is I've got a few more slides. I will finish those and I will post all of this up for you. Don't forget your test.